In the mud of the Western Front in 1916, a soldier's survival depended on a lot of things, but one of the most critical vulnerabilities wasn't a lack of ammunition or manpower, it was timekeeping. If an officer's watch was off by even a few minutes, coordinating an attack became a deadly gamble. Before the war, standard timekeeping looked like this. A fine pocket watch was the undisputed mark of status and sophistication. Wristwatches, on the other hand, were called wristlets. The entire watchmaking establishment dismissed them as delicate jewelry for women, too small to be accurate and too fragile to be practical. The man who would challenge that entire establishment grew up hundreds of miles away in a small Bavarian town. By the time Hans Wilsdorf was 12 years old, he had lost both of his parents. Instead of taking him in, his uncles promptly sold off his family's generations-old iron tools business, locked the money in a trust, and shipped him to a boarding school. Wilsdorf was suddenly stripped of all family wealth and security, but that isolation forced an intense self-reliance. It conditioned him to look past conventional wisdom and spot opportunities others ignored. Looking at the bulky, cumbersome pocket watches of the era, he realized the future belonged on the wrist. He decided to bet his entire life on the very product the industry was laughing at. By 1905, Wilsdorf had moved to London, the commercial hub of the British Empire, to start his own watch import business. He wanted a brand name that could stand alone, something short, melodic, easy to pronounce in any European language, and compact enough to fit cleanly on a tiny dial. He settled on one word: Rolex. Having a catchy name solved the marketing problem, but Wilsdorf still had an engineering hurdle. To legitimize the wristwatch in a world dominated by pocket watches, he had to prove that a miniature movement could keep precise time. He had to silence the skeptics completely. This visualization breaks down his solution. In 1914, Wilsdorf submitted a tiny Rolex to the Kew Observatory in Great Britain. This institution certified marine chronometers for the Royal Navy. They subjected instruments to 45 grueling days of continuous testing across 5 different positions and extreme temperatures. A failure meant ships crashing into rocks. Submitting a fragile wristwatch to this gauntlet was considered absurd. But the Rolex passed. It recorded an average daily deviation of just 1 second per day, earning the Class A certificate. He had taken a product dismissed as a trinket and proven it could match the finest navigation equipment on Earth. And he did it precisely 14 days before the outbreak of World War I. The war introduced brutal new combat tactics. One of the most deadly was the creeping barrage. Infantry units advanced just yards behind a moving wall of friendly artillery fire. If a unit's timing was off by even a few minutes, their own friendly artillery would completely wipe them out. Trying to fish a pocket watch out of a heavy coat while crawling through mud simply was not an option. Overnight, a luminous, shatterproof wristwatch went from a joke to a life-or-death military necessity. But while the war validated his product, it threatened his company. Wilsdorf was a German-born man living in London with a German name. Anti-German sentiment swept through Britain, leading to harassment and boycotts. To make matters worse, the British government slapped a 33. By the 1930s, wristwatches were outselling pocket watches 50-1. The mud of the trenches had proven the wristwatch was practical, but it also exposed its vulnerability to the elements. Because they lived on the wrist, these watches were exposed to dust and moisture that could seep through tiny gaps and destroy the delicate movement inside. Wilsdorf spent the next decade obsessed with a single problem: how to build a watch case that was completely and permanently sealed from the outside world. This diagram illustrates his solution. In 1926, Rolex released the Oyster. The design used a 3-piece system with a screw-down bezel and a screw-down caseback, anchored by an internal clutch mechanism inside a patented screw-down crown. It allowed the winding mechanism to clamp tightly against the case, sealing out dirt and moisture. Claims of being waterproof meant nothing without proof. In 1927, Wilsdorf asked a young English swimmer named Mercedes Gleitz to wear a Rolex Oyster on a ribbon around her neck while she attempted to cross the freezing English Channel. After more than 10 grueling hours in the water, she was pulled onto a boat. The watch was still ticking perfectly, but there was a lingering issue. Every time a user unscrewed that crown to wind the watch, the seal was compromised. In 1931, Rolex introduced the perpetual movement. A full 360-degree rotor harnessed the natural motion of the wearer's wrist to wind the mainspring automatically, without touching the crown. You simply wore it, and it cowered itself. Hermetically sealed cases made Rolex the standard for military elites during the Second World War. Royal Air Force pilots routinely bought them with their own paychecks because government-issued watches couldn't handle the demands of aerial combat. When British officers were shot down and sent to prisoner of war camps, Wilsdorf offered to replace their confiscated watches on credit, refusing payment until after the war ended. By building hardware for these environments and extending personal trust to soldiers behind enemy lines, Wilsdorf gained a loyalty that spanned generations and crossed borders. Then, in 1944, a devastating blow struck. Wilsdorf's beloved wife Florence passed away. They had no children. At 63 years old, he was entirely alone, with no heirs to leave his life's work to. This created a massive vulnerability for the company. Without a clear successor, there was a real risk that after his death, Rolex would be sold off or liquidated. It was the exact same scenario that had played out when he was 12 years old and his uncles sold his family's iron business. This diagram outlines his defense mechanism. To ensure his empire would never be taken apart, Wilsdorf established a private charitable trust in Geneva. He then moved 100% of his ownership, transferring every single share directly into the foundation. With a stroke of a pen, Wilsdorf moved Rolex beyond the reach of the market, ensuring it would never answer to outside shareholders or quarterly earnings targets. The company had become an untouchable corporate sovereign state. Shielded from outside interference, the company entered a golden age of innovation. In 1953, members of the British expedition relied on Rolex Oyster Perpetuals as they became the first to stand on the summit of Mount Everest. In 1960, a specially designed Rolex was strapped to the outside of a bathyscaphe and plunged to the deepest point in the ocean, the Mariana Trench. It survived the crushing pressure perfectly intact. This chart illustrates the modern outcome of that independence. Today, Rolex commands 32% of the entire Swiss luxury watch market. It outsells its next 5 largest competitors combined, with an estimated valuation approaching $100 billion. And to this day, the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation still retains total control. It answers to no one, funnels its massive profits back into improving the watches, and reportedly donates hundreds of millions to charitable causes every single year. It is an empire built on a foundation of loss. An orphaned boy took the trauma of losing everything and built a product designed to outlast its environment and its own creator.